Welcome to the Tanya Acker Show. Ezzedine Fishere is a distinguished fellow at Dartmouth College. And prior to that, he spent years working at the heart of Middle East politics, both as an Egyptian ambassador and also as a senior political advisor at the UN. He's also a writer, and he recently penned an op-ed in the Washington Post, which puts forth, as he describes it, the best second choice option for all impacted stakeholders in the Gaza conflict, which is really one of the most intransigent conflicts I think that we've seen in our time. It is one thing to discuss a problem and to talk about what the problem entails. It's quite another to put forward a solution. And I should let you know that the solution that Ezzedine has put forward has been very well received by a number of those impacted by this war and that conflict. So without further ado, here I am with Ezzedine Fishere. Thank you for being here. And please subscribe to the podcast. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Ezzedine Fishere. It is a thrill to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor.
So let's just jump right into it. You recently published an op-ed where you pose a very creative solution to what seemed to be two incredibly intransigent problems. The first problem is Israel's ongoing security concern, given the proximity to Hamas, which rules the Gaza Strip. We should point out that all of the hostages seized on October 7th by Hamas still have not been released. And the second problem is the humanitarian tragedy, and that's putting it, I think, very mildly, that's taking place in Gaza. When those of us who are looking, and I think it's many people, see what's happening there, it looks like, to put it very mildly, some terrestrial version of hell. So you've put forward a solution. Tell us what you believe that solution should look like.
Well, thank you. And I think the way you put the question is very helpful because those two elements are the basic elements of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's very complex, as you know, and there are so many issues kind of involved in how we look and understand this conflict. But ultimately, you can boil it down to this. There is always the security concerns for Israel. And what happened in October 7 is the worst case scenario that anybody who is empathetic to Israel and its issues has been afraid could happen. So October 7 came to confirm the worst fears of Israelis. At the same time, the response that Israel puts in order to protect its security almost always leads to some version of what we're seeing in Gaza today. As much as October 7 was a kind of a steroid version of Israeli fears, what's happened in Gaza since then is, again, a display on steroids of how Israel responds to Palestinian threats to its security. So any solution, and this is where I think my solution comes in, any solution has to start not with litigating the conflict and who's right and who's wrong, but in finding a practical way to address Israel's security concerns and to address Palestinians' legitimate rights to live in dignity and to exercise self-determination. This is what my solution is trying to do, is find a practical way to achieve those two goals.
I think that the way that you conceptualize your solution, which we'll get to, as a pragmatic solution really sort of resonates vis-a-vis any conflict writ large. I mean, I'm a lawyer and I've litigated situations. Certainly, I've never been involved in a situation where the stakes are as high as they are here. But the thing that resonated with me about what you've put forward, which we'll discuss, is that anytime there's a conflict where there are long simmering and long standing tensions, and by the way, for everyone listening, this will not be a primer on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's a lot of research and work that you can study and review if you want to get up to speed. People have different perspectives about how we got to here. I think what's most valuable, Ezzedine, about what you're doing is you talk about where we go next. So where is that? What does it look like? We've got two entities, one which, again, has very real and viable security concerns. If you see those images and you understand what is happening to people, civilians, and I think it's important to remember that the devastation that's taking place in Gaza is impacting civilians, children, humans, people just trying to carry on with their lives, then what you see are two constituencies with valid interests. And when I say the two constituencies, I'm talking about the Israelis and the Gazan civilians who are really trying to address probably, again, as I said at the outset, one of the most intransigent human rights and foreign policy questions that we are confronting in modern times. So we are where we are right now. We can't relitigate the past, or at least we certainly aren't going to do that on this podcast. How do you go from this terrible moment where both sides are feeling afraid to the next? How do you move the ball?
Excellent. Thank you. As a lawyer, if you're talking to your clients and if they keep expressing the grievances they have about what happened to them and the past and how unjust all of this is, as a lawyer, you're obligated, I imagine, as a human being also to empathize and, listen with empathy. But it doesn't change the legal case. It doesn't change the outcome. And I think this is important. This is not just rhetoric. It's important to remind the listener that there are multiple ways of looking at this conflict. You can look at it in an attempt to find out who's right and who's wrong, which side you empathize with, who is morally outrageous then, and who is morally the victim. And that's very legitimate. I'm not saying you cannot do that. But I'm saying that this is not related or relevant to finding solutions. Finding solutions is finding this area of convergence where each party is going to walk out not terribly happy, but not terribly unhappy. That they find an area where they can say, this was not what I was hoping for, but I can live with this. So what would that be is the question. If you're Steve Witkoff, you want to find a solution, this is what you're thinking about. You're not thinking about who was right in doing what. You're not thinking about, how deeply rooted the hatred is, or what they did to us or to our parents and all of that. I'm not saying it's irrelevant in absolute terms, but it's irrelevant to finding a solution. So from there, what can be done today if you want to disentangle this conflict and disarm the potential that it has to blow up the region more than it is already blown up? First, you need to find a solution to Israel's security concern. Because if you don't, Israel is going to do it its own way. And we have seen how does this look like. So we need to find another way. The question becomes, can the Palestinians provide Israel, the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, provide Israel with security guarantees? The answer is no, because Israel does not trust the Palestinian Authority, does not trust its ability or its intent, and definitely does not trust Hamas. So you need a third party to provide security. Who would that be in Gaza? Either an international force or, as I am suggesting, Egypt. That's one question. If you go on the other side, can Hamas surrender? Can we kind of keep bombing Gaza until Hamas says, mea culpa, this was a mistake, I'm sorry, here are my weapons, I'm going to dissolve my terrorist organization? The answer is no. They're not going to do that under no circumstances. So the question becomes, what can we do in order to get Hamas military threat out of the way? And here is my suggestion, again, Egypt. So the solution is as follows. Egypt takes full control of Gaza. the Gaza Strip. We transfer the Gaza Strip. Egypt becomes a custodial power entrusted with Gaza. It's not an annexation. It's custodianship, a trusteeship. Then Hamas. So you need two agreements for this to happen. You need an agreement between Egypt and the Palestinian Authority, Egypt and Hamas, both. By this agreement, number one, Hamas will hand its weapons to the Egyptian army and will register its members with Egyptian security. So you have a program of disarmament and demobilization. So you also know where everybody is. They don't kind of disappear in the population. That's one. And two, Egypt will take over security and administrative responsibilities over the Gaza Strip and deploy its army and take full security responsibility for it and establish a Palestinian civilian administration, a new one, a Palestinian civilian administration for the Strip, and a new Palestinian security service that can actually do the police work and so on and so forth. That's one side. The other side is another agreement between Egypt and Israel, through which Egypt and Israel agree on a mechanism for the Israeli army to gradually, progressively withdraw and hand responsibilities to the Egyptian deploying army, and a mechanism to monitor the borders, prevent further attacks, and prevent infiltration, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the overall. Egypt then becomes the party negotiating with Israel and the party that is responsible for the Strip. And Egypt becomes at the same time a custodial power for the Gaza Strip, which is not inconsistent with a future Palestinian state. But if this future Palestinian state is going to emerge out of this deal, it will emerge on new basis. It will emerge on rule of law. It will emerge on economic development and reconstruction, building hope forward, coexistence and peace, not violence and retribution, and so on.
So let me ask you this. Why would the Israelis agree to this? What's in it for them to have Egypt as a new partner? And why would Hamas agree to turn over its weapons? I believe it was just yesterday that the Saudis, Qatar, and Egypt called for Hamas to stand down, relinquish power, turn over its weapons. So perhaps there's already some momentum for this from third-party states, but talk a little bit about why the Israelis would be amenable to this deal, and talk about whether or not you think Egypt has the leverage to get Hamas to take this kind of deal.
I will add to your question on why would Egypt want to take on such a terrible responsibility?
Great addition. Great addition. Why would Egypt even want to do this?
So the short answer is none of the three is going to love this solution. None of the three is going to say, yes, thank you, Ezzedine. This is what we were hoping for, right? Now, because this is not the best case scenario for any of the parties. However, my claim is this is the second best. And it's far better than the realistic alternative. As an immediate kind of payoff, this agreement, those two agreements, this deal will ensure a release of all the hostages remaining and a return of all the bodies and a permanent ceasefire. That's the two things that both parties care about. And I don't see any other solution other than a deal that can bring those two. You can have another temporary ceasefire, get 10 hostages out, but then they remain, you're still trapped with their, right?
There are people who are still there and there are bodies that have not been returned to their families.
Yes. And then after the ceasefire, temporary ceasefire is over, then you resume that mayhem again. So as a start, you need something that is durable, that brings peace or at least a cessation of violence and the release of the hostages. This achieves that. Now, why this is the second best? Because look at the best option for any of the parties. For Israel, the best option is to eliminate Hamas, eliminate all threats from Gaza, right? And not relinquish control over Gaza. It's not going to happen. Israel has been fighting in Gaza, had a free reign, had been doing practically anything it wanted for how many months, how many casualties, and still cannot, it hasn't achieved that. there's no indication that it's on the way of achieving that. So that's one. Hamas' best case scenario is that it comes out of this, controlling the Gaza Strip, using it as a linchpin for its armed resistance, and maintaining its ability to rule Gaza, including reconstructing Gaza. None of this is going to happen. There is no way this is going to happen, given what happened in October 7 and Israel kind of new attitude towards Gaza. Egypt's best case scenario is to keep Gaza an Israeli problem and to stay out of it and keep the problems contained between those two parties. Basically, Egypt's best case scenario is to go back to the prior October 7. But again, that's no longer an option. And Gaza has become an Egyptian problem. It weighs on Egyptian fragile political situation, and it weighs heavily on Egypt's fragile economic situation, because there are impacts of global navigation, Suez Canal, and so on and so forth. It's very, very detrimental that this to Egypt, that this continues the way it is. The key then is to get the parties to climb down from kind of holding on to the illusion of achieving their best case scenario and offering them a ladder to a second best. What is the second best? For Israel. Israel already works with Egypt. They have a very solid security relationship that has grown over the last 50 years. For 50 years, those two countries who went to war several times, who led the conflict for decades, have had zero security incidents. They have a very solid, not only, it is a cold peace, they don't really like Israel a lot in Egypt, but it doesn't matter. The security partnership is very solid and has been tested in wars, in regional conflicts, in terrorist operations against Israel, sometimes through Egyptian territories. And it has withheld the pressure it has been subject to. Israel withdrawal from Gaza enhanced the cooperation with Egypt, didn't diminish it. And even through all what we have seen in Gaza, the security cooperation between the two. There has been a war in Sinai with the Islamic State in Sinai, between Egypt and the Islamic State. And Israel and Egypt cooperated in this. So we already have something to build on. That's for Israel. For Hamas, again, Hamas is very weakened, but not crushed completely. And the incentive for them would be that you offer Hamas a face-saving exit from that devastating cycle that it is trapped into. And it can claim that it has liberated Gaza from Israeli occupation. And it will be handing its weapons to Egyptian army, not to its arch enemy. And so it's not a surrender. And at the same time, Hamas can then redefine itself as a political party without a military wing and be part of the political landscape, which all Palestinians kind of agree should be the outcome for Hamas. So it offers them a way. Again, it's the second best. It's not surrender. It's not defeat. You can even claim that you have achieved something tangible and a building stone for Palestinian self-determination, which nobody has achieved to do so far.
I certainly don't want to minimize the stakes at issue here, which are different from any and higher, frankly, from any in which I've ever been involved as a lawyer. But when you talk about getting people to embrace the second best solution, that's really the heart of any sort of compromise in any dispute. If two people really hate each other or are very mad at each other or have been offended by each other, nobody is going to show up at the table and get everything they want. And so it is the lawyer's job to say, listen, you're not going to get all the money that you want. They're going to pay you something. They're not going to apologize for ruining your life forever, but they're going to create some mechanism for you to move forward. And same, if it's the other side, they may have said these horrible things about you in court that are completely untrue and have embarrassed you. But now we're going to put court aside and they're agreeing to stop talking about you. You look for a second best. Nobody ever gets everything they want when they are in any hotly contested dispute, and certainly not one that's been as long-standing as this one. So you've explained why this deal would be appealing to Israel. And I know that you've gotten a lot of response from both Israelis and Egyptians about this. I want to talk about that. But first, I want to talk about you, because something that I want my viewers and listeners to know is that I know you. I met you. We have a mutual friend, a very good mutual friend, who was involved in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations when there was a peace process. And I actually met you the year that Israel was pulling out of Gaza.
In Jerusalem.
You may not remember, in Jerusalem.
Yes.
And it was a different time. Israel had just pulled out of Gaza. And I think that there was some sense amongst those of us, who are a little further removed from this and who don't necessarily have a horse in the fight, but were watching it as interested third-party observers. There was a sense that things were moving in a way that stopped, and they didn't. There is no peace process. Israel moved out of Gaza. The Gazans had an election. Hamas was elected. They haven't had an election since. And look at where we are now. But before we turn to some of that, you live here now. You teach at Dartmouth. You're a dissident. You're an Egyptian dissident. You were very involved in the pro-democracy movement in Egypt after the Tahrir Square moment. And Egypt didn't go in the direction for which you were advocating. You live in America. I wonder why it is, or rather, can you sort of talk to people about why you would put forward Egypt as a valid partner in this, when kind of given some of your own experiences, you choose not to live there anymore?
Yes, I think those two things are not mutually exclusive. You can be a Democrat and you oppose the current Trump administration, and for a number of reasons that you can elaborate on and talk about for a long time. I have the same attitude. I can talk, chew your ears off why a military regime in Egypt that doesn't respect the rule of law, that drives the economy down the drain, and so on, is bad for Egypt. And I choose a different way of governing Egypt and so on. But that doesn't mean that you don't see a role for the United States globally. In the Middle East, you don't think the U.S. should be leading the parties to a peaceful outcome of their conflict, or in relations with economic and trade relations with Canada and Mexico and the European Union, you don't see a leading role for the United States to rebuild the global economy. Those things are not mutually exclusive. You can oppose an administration or even a regime, as I do in the case of Egypt, and still think that Egypt or that country has a critical role to play. And it does. Egypt has a role to play in the conflict with Israel because it's there, it's right there, and because of its historical involvement with the Palestinians, and because its own population feels very strongly about Israel and Palestine and so on. All of these things make Egypt an interested party, and the only question becomes, it's not whether Egypt will play a role or not play a role. It will be. The question is, what role will Egypt play? And what I'm trying to suggest here is that Egypt could be a leading role, could play a leading role in solving this conflict. Maybe at a deeper level, and that touches your kind of the art of deciding theme that you have, is that we all make decisions. I rephrase that. Practical people, pragmatic people, make decisions based on the alternatives that are available to them. I participated at the Tahrir uprising, and for a time we thought that we're democratizing Egypt, and then that collapsed. We're here now, and the options I have today, if I'm given an options, if the current regime in Egypt says we're going to have a partial liberalization and opening, I would support that. It will be less than my optimal scenario, but it's definitely better than full repression. If we can have more rule of law in Egypt, I would support that, and I would ask everybody to support it. If the World Bank and the IMF come up with a plan for economic recovery of Egypt and improvement of rule of law, I would encourage everybody to get on board and push for that, even if it's less than perfect. Perfect doesn't happen. If somebody's going to bring perfect around, nobody will object to it. But between perfect and terrible, there are so many options. And I'd like to push for, as much as possible, a good option among those ones.
You can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And you are a reminder. You are a reminder that nuance and the art of nuance is still alive and well. And to your point, this is actually in Egypt's interest to provide some stabilization of the region. So let me ask you something else, because I talked about the moment in that region that was taking place when you and I first met, when Israel was pulling out of Gaza, and we saw what happened. I think that a question for a lot of us who aren't, close observers or students of the politics of the Middle East, we're always kind of like, it seems like something good happens, but then what happens next? So let's say that all interested parties move forward with this idea of an Egyptian custodianship.
Mm-hmm.
What happens after that? I mean, is Egypt going to be there perpetually? What are the markers and what is the path toward Palestinian self-determination that is also consistent with Israeli security? You can talk about Palestinian self-determination. We will end up back where we are right now if Israel's valid security concerns aren't addressed.
Yes.
So how do you get those two things to work in tandem?
Yes. Nothing can be solved permanently by one measure. Only in movies where you can a finale, but even, modern drama has moved beyond the happy ever after. Because partly commercially you can have a season 2, but think of any conflict that has any peace agreement that we had. Think of the end of apartheid. Is the end of apartheid the end of injustice? Can you just have, once Mandela becomes president, everything's going to be okay, and then we can all go home and forget about South Africa? No. Today in South Africa, the struggle continues for social justice. It takes different forms. Look at Northern Ireland. Look at any conflict. Israel-Palestine is no different. If this deal becomes reality, Egypt becomes a custodian power, I can imagine 2 different scenarios and everything in between. Number 1, Egypt actually pulls it off, gets the new Palestinian administration, becomes a nucleus for a modern, law-abiding Palestinian state that's looking forward. And then eventually that model is replicated in the West Bank. And eventually we have a Palestinian self-determination that leads to a Palestinian state living in peace and security with Israel. So you can have this rosy kind of scenario coming out. And you can think of all kinds of disasters that could happen out of this. All of this is possible. The only thing is, number 1, whether you can put together a number of mechanisms that deal with what you can anticipate as challenges that will come or not. And number 2, whether you sustain the effort and keep the focus in the following kind of years and maybe decades as you move forward. There is no silver bullet that kind of solves everything. Egypt has legitimate security concerns about this solution. What would guarantee that Hamas doesn't rearm? And then it becomes an Egypt problem. Egypt go and have to fight as, do Israel's work, for instance. What would guarantee that Hamas doesn't rearm, attacks Israel, then Israel attacks Gaza, which is now under Egyptian control, and we go back to the scenario that the situation we had in the 1950s, where this becomes, a cause for war between Egypt and Israel. Nobody wants that. So those are legitimate concerns. The question then becomes, again, in the art of deciding, if you want to help the Egyptians make the right decision is to engage with them seriously. Just like, how can we help you to effectively deal with those concerns? The same thing with Israel. But this is the kind of conversation that Steve Witkoff would have with Egyptian officials, Egyptian president in this case, because he's the only one who decides these things, Israeli officials and the Palestinians. It's to find practical ways, not based on trust, because in this business, no one trusts the other, but based on verifiable, demonstrable measures that are solid, and get them together and have a mechanism to sustain this over a long period of time.
You've been very complimentary of Steve Witkoff, and we should bring people into the loop about who he is. Tell us who he is and tell us why you think he is moving forward in a thoughtful and precise way right now.
Well, Steve Witkoff is the president's envoy for peace missions, and it's a vague title because you will see him one day sitting with Putin, and then the other day is in the Middle East with Netanyahu, and then with representatives who talk to the Palestinians. So he is the president's man in dealing with those conflicts, whether it's Ukraine, sometimes China and trade, and the Middle East. And I'm using Steve Witkoff not as a person, although I think I admire his approach, which is how we get a deal and not, addressing grievances, historical grievances, but how we can get a deal under the current circumstances. But I'm using Steve Witkoff as a shortcut for the United States and its role in this region. And it's very fashionable to hate the United States. People love to hate the United States. And people love to hate the American role in this conflict and to diminish it. And it's not neutral. It's not this. It is not that. But if you take a step back and think and look, who else is trying to bring the parties together? Do you see any other country, any other global power that is actually working to bring the Israelis and Palestinians and Arab states together in order to move them forward? Personally, I don't. Is the American role perfect? It is not. But again, that's the second best. It is the only country in this world that is actually leading an effort to bring the parties together and move them to a better place for all of them. Does it have its own interests? Of course it does. It's a state. It's not a reason to dismiss or diminish the role it plays. So in this business, the only country that is actually you can hope will lead such an effort is the United States. This is why I keep referring to Steve Witkoff.
Well, he's a good substitute for the United States in this conversation since he is President Trump's envoy. Like he's representing the United States.
He's representing the United States.
Yeah. So the metaphor isn't really a metaphor. It's sort of the practicality of it all. What's also really incredible about your piece is the reception that it's receiving around the world. It came out at a time where these other Arab nations have just said to Hamas, it's time to put the guns down and relinquish power. You don't get to run Gaza anymore. Talk a little bit, if you would, about the reaction to your piece and what you think that means in terms of potential next steps.
The reaction has been very encouraging in the sense that, as you said, many Israelis, some of them would rather remain unnamed, but I'm talking about opposition leaders and former prime ministers and so on, found a lot of merit in the idea and thought that this is something. The important part is not the personal part, but that they think that Israel can. This is something that Israel can work with, and I think that's as good as a starting point as anybody needs. That this is something Israel can work with. That this is something the Palestinians can work with, that this is something the Arab states can work with. But then all of the reactions had similar questions. Would Egypt accept to do this? What would make Egypt accept to play this role? How we can get Israel and so on. So there are all those legitimate questions. But the reception I'm getting from all quarters, including former American officials and Israelis is that this is something much more promising than the alternative we have today. The alternative we have today is one of two things. Number one is ceasefire talks, which is a temporary ceasefire. I just want to remind everybody, temporary ceasefire. And then when people talk about the day after, there are all these vague references to maybe we have a technocratic committee running Gaza, but Hamas stays in the background. Or we call on Hamas to disarm and leave. But what does that mean if you call on them? And why would they do that? And disarm to who? And all of these questions. Or there is this talk of an international force that would go in Gaza. And Israel traditionally doesn't trust international forces. It has negative experiences with other international. I worked for the UN, and we tried, you're talking about the 2005 when we met in Jerusalem. At the time, we were pushing for deploying an international force, a UN force in Gaza as Israel withdraws to do a number of things. And Israel had, Prime Minister Sharon at the time had no interest whatsoever. We talked to people at AIPAC here in Washington about this option. They had no interest whatsoever. And you know who they had interest in back in 2005? Who did they want to come in Gaza? An Egyptian force. Because they, ironically, trusted the Egyptian military and security and their ability to deal with counterterrorism or with kind of terrorism activities. For a variety of reasons, they trusted more the Egyptians than they trusted an international force. As somebody mentioned, he's like, I don't want New Zealanders to deploy in Gaza. I don't think they would be very effective. But I want Egyptians to deploy in Gaza. So the reception, the short answer to your question is the reception shows that we're on to some, that, there is something. But again, it's not a silver bullet. There are multiple discussions and conversations that need to be had in order to kind of fine tune and build on this. But I think it's a good direction.
I think that the way that you described the Egyptian-Israeli relationship as a cold peace is really, that's a very beautiful metaphor. It's sort of, because, you can kind of think about, there's that other party where you don't necessarily like them. You're probably not going to invite each other to your parties, but they're not going to blow you up. And that if somebody is coming over to their house with plans to blow you up, they'll take them down. Sometimes that's the best you can ask for. Sometimes Absolutely. In the world, yes. Certainly that's the best for which you can hope. Ezzedine Fishere, professor at Dartmouth, former UN diplomat, Egyptian diplomat. We did not talk about your incredible work as a novelist, but I just have to say, as somebody who is doesn't live there, and but I think pays a lot of attention and is devastated. But by what I see happening there, I am grateful to you for sort of thinking creatively and doing more than simply trying to rehash problems, but also to try to devise solutions. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you very much, Tanya. You're doing a great work. And I think listening to your multiple podcasts, each one of them is a gem. It highlights an important problem, a different one, and usually with a fresh look at them. So thank you for doing this as well.
Thank you for that, my friend. Be well.